Hello and welcome to another episode of On the Waterfront, sponsored by Waterfront Logistics. I'm Weston LaBar, and today I have the great pleasure of having Dr. Brad Bauerly from the University of Vermont's Political Science Department with me. Many of you may or may not know I'm a proud alumnus of the University of Vermont Political Science Department, and I'm so glad to have Dr. Bauerly here with me today to talk through the impacts that we've seen on geopolitics and the global supply chain. Brad, thanks for joining the program.
Thanks for having me, Weston. Happy to be here to talk about trade.
Yeah, so why don't we start by giving a little bit of a background of who you are, your areas of expertise, and then we can start to lean into a little bit about what we'll talk about today, which is policy impacts on global trade.
I graduated from high school in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, uh, ushering in the what Francis Fukuyama said was the end of history, where in the future battles weren't going to be about ideology, they were going to be about other things, and the human project was sort of done experimenting with different approaches, and we've decided that the capitalist liberal order was going to be dominant for forever was sometimes the claim. Also, then that ushers in what I would call the era of globalization uh, from that point forward. And then, so my whole career as a political scientist has been studying this period of globalization. So the whole arc runs from beginning of my career with its initial starts to today, where it looks like trade is at least fracturing a bit into competing blocks with different interests, and sort of how that played out, as well as sort of the uh, domestic political effects of trade as well. And sort of we've seen that play out in various ways here as well as elsewhere.
Yeah, and thank you. And you talked about a little bit the post-Soviet collapse, and most of us have grown up, at least professionally, in a post-Soviet economy, right? The Soviet Union collapse, the Soviet bloc is dismantled. The United States becomes the clear and undisputed hegemonic or one true power in the entire world, influencing everything from foreign policy to trade and supply chain. And in the 90s, one of the big efforts from the United States was globalization, and we helped create our biggest competitor in today's global trade market, which is China. Talk a little bit about that experience from the United States perspective, because quite frankly, all of us have grown up in some way, shape, or form professionally in a world that has migrated from a lot of domestic manufacturing to global trade from at least a component level, which has made us so much more reliant on countries outside of the United States and have made more and more countries reliant on the United States as a trading partner as well.
Yeah, so like the original push, right, to get China allowed into the World Trade Organization, Bill Clinton sort of personally spearheaded that initiative. The argument, the basis of the argument around why we would allow in sort of this non-liberal democracy into what was at that time mostly still sort of a club for liberal democracies to exist in the trading bloc, why we'd let them in. The argument was this, what they call the functionalist argument, that connecting tightly economically would pull China closer and closer towards and cause them to adapt and accept our political system. So the idea was it would pull them towards liberal democracy. Um,
Hasn't worked out
I
that
was
way
talking.
so well, but
No,
continue,
I was talking
please.
to put this forward with my students just today. We were talking about this, and my students basically agreed that the opposite pretty much happened, and that increasingly the West is being pulled towards, I would argue, less democratic, more authoritarian forms of politics in response to sort of the rise of China and what it's been able to do there through this process, right? And why the WTO and Western nations continue to make excuses and allow for China to violate trade rules. Again, the idea being that this will pull them into a liberal democratic system, and as we said, that simply did not work out that way. Those theories were sort of flawed. Um, yeah, I could talk more about the functionalist theory. It's been applied multiple times. It doesn't really work out that way.
Yeah, it's interesting because we go from the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. Obviously, we were very heavily involved in regime changes throughout the globe that helped us on a trade on a trade level, right? They either had resources or products or people or something that the U.S. wanted as a valued trade partner. Then you fast forward, Soviet Union collapses. The U.S. becomes the undisputed leader in global trade, the hegemonic power that influences all trade in the world. We then are a big advocate for free trade, globalization. We build China up. We get to today where China is our biggest. I think both resource and our biggest competitor in global trade. And it's been that way, in a scaling fashion for the last 20 years, right? Let's say 30 years. And now what we're seeing is sort of the decoupling of this idea of global trade, free trade, and this notion to moving more into trade blocks, allies around common interests, common benefits from being trade partners. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of where we've come from a post-Soviet climate to now almost heading back into exclusive trade blocks and trade partners?
Yeah, so again, that process is tightly wrapped up in what I sort of introduced at the beginning, or started talking about, sort of allowing China into the WTO despite it not wanting to necessarily align completely with the policy preferences and goals of the West. And slowly through that process and allowing them to continue to do that, it's slowly, I guess, eroded at least the industrial base of the West. And through that process, it's elevated China to the point where now it's sort of begun to challenge the foundational basis around which that whole trading structure was constructed. As you rightly say, the U.S. was instrumental in sort of building up this whole trading apparatus. That's, an important point that I bring out in my international political economy classes, is that, trading relations, free trade, that doesn't happen because of less state. The theory early in globalization was that the state is going to recede, right? And these economic relations are going to supplant, and we're not going to have the need really for national-based politics in the same way. But the problem with that is, of course, trade involves increasing politics, increasing integration and coordination between states. You need to align court systems, you need to align intellectual property rights, you need to align currencies, you need to align tariff rates. All of this politics has to happen in order to have trading relations. These things don't just pop up by their own. And then on top of that, we also have international institutions that are trying to smooth those relations, deal with the problems that come up with trade, the World Trade Organization, all kinds of trade treaties, all kinds of bilateral investment treaties, all kinds of, as I said, basically political institutions set up to manage and help allow for this trading environment to happen. And now with the breakdown, and I would sort of say that what was happening is that you had in the background divergence between these two systems, as I said, the sort of Western liberal democratic capitalism and the more authoritarian capitalism. And those were on different trajectories. And then COVID comes in, really causes some concerns about supply chains and reliance on these countries that are, heterogeneous from us in certain ways. Like, they're just distinct in different ways, and they want to do things differently, which, is fine and good. In a democratic world, you would allow different states to do things differently and all of that. But then that's starting to undermine our dependence in terms of supply chains and supply chain distributions. Because what happens during this period of globalization is manufacturing starts to offshore in one place, but then through this process, basically it distributes through a distributed supply chain around the world, so that the input parts that go into the final product that then eventually gets shipped here happens all over the world, right? So those supply chains are very important. Also, we found out through COVID, they're kind of fragile in certain places, right? And so, as you said, sort of slowly these divergent trajectories have pulled politics back into the conversation at the same time that COVID basically got us concerned about supply chains. And so in the wake of COVID, there was a big issue with, or a big concern in the West with trying to shore up some of those supply chain lines, friendshoring, other names for it come up. So trying to deal more with allies and secure lines because of the political disputes that were partially popping up, the differences in ideology and trajectories of different countries, and our dependence on them was starting to create some problems, as you might expect them to over time. Again, because the functionalist theory didn't work out. trade didn't pull all nations into a common shared value set. It didn't smooth over all of our differences. All it did is create product connections, and then the reliance on those means that those divergent political systems become an issue at some point.
And before we hop into the geopolitical spectrum, because I think for the first time in our industry, the last year or two, geopolitics has become even more prevalent in how it impacts day to day supply chains. You know, you think of the Houthis and the Suez Canal and what that did to global trade. Obviously, the key topic here in the United States for the last several years has been tariffs. I mean, really going back to Trump 45, right? And in 2018, you had all the 301 and 321 tariffs put into place, which started this process, sort of went on pause. Nothing was scaled back, nothing was scaled forward during the Biden administration, and then Trump 47 comes back in and picks up sort of where he left off and has expanded it. But you know, if you look at what's happened in the last 30 years, and I'd love your take on this, we're really replicating what happened during colonization in the colonial era. It's just except differently. Instead of going in and militaristically colonizing areas, a lot of it was done through foreign aid, foreign investment, and you know the U.S. has done a lot of it through foreign aid, but China has done it through foreign investment, buying bridges, buying ports, building the infrastructure, and I love to talk about the fact that you know, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Vermont in 2007, I wrote a paper for Professor Peter Von Depp, who's now the department chair, who you know very well, obviously. And it was about China pivoting from the decade it's had being the benefactor of US globalization and starting to invest in places like West Africa, which could have an impact on global supply chains. Obviously, if manufacturing is being done in place like West Africa, it changes a supply chain to a transatlantic route as opposed to a trans-Pacific route from Asia to the west coast of the US. And this has sort of slowly been happening over the years and the decades until we get to today, where you're in a full blown trade war at times. Can you talk a little bit about how we got here today and how some of these trade blocks or organically or maybe forced organically came together?
Yeah, so you tell an accurate sort of history, and I would agree, and most scholarship sort of tends to agree that um, a lot of these practices were what they'd call neo-colonial in relationships. So yes, states act in their own interests, right? Like that shouldn't be a shocking thing that states are acting in their own interests, right? The shocking thing is that people believe that states wouldn't act in their own, right? That they'd set up trading relations that are going to benefit everybody else, but we don't have any interest in setting. Like that's not really how the world works, and so that's part of what's going on. I mean, I do think it goes beyond that and sort of implying that this is mutually beneficial when perhaps it wasn't. But that's back to the sort of the ideology of globalization and sort of the arc of that ideology from something that's just happening and there's no alternative and it's going to erode the state to one where we are today, where it's like, well, it all involved choices and trade-offs, and there's politics embedded in all of this. But to talk about the current breakup into blocks, if you want to put it that way. That's kind of the way it's discussed, is that the sort of multilateral trading group is fracturing into different competing blocks. And I would push that back even further than the first Trump administration into Obama's pivot to Asia. And some of the attempts early on in the Obama administration to create trading relationships that would block out China. There was a real shift during that period to start to combat China and their rising influence, particularly in the wake of the '08 crisis. They did a big stimulus push, and they had lots of capital that they started to invest around the Silk Road. You're talking about sort of investments in ports in Africa and other places and rail lines and things like that. And so there's a shift that happens with China's behavior there too. And then the first Trump administration really sort of, I'm going to say, weaponizes trade through tariffs in a way that I think is a major turning point that gets us to where we are today. Once the dominant power starts to see this as something you can weaponize and use as leverage, right? Your the purchasing power of American consumers used as leverage against other nations to extract political or economic gain for us, then it's kind of overtly becomes something else than what it was covertly, doing similarly before, right? It's putting the national interest of the U.S. front and center, and even not even worrying much about the consent part. Hegemony is really usually understood as combining coercion and consent. So it's getting other people to go along with your rule. And so it's adding benefits from them that pulls them into the system that then strengthens the overall structure, right? And it's gone kind of from consent in the system to one where we're basically coercing other states into making deals with us to continue sort of trade relations. So we've weaponized the consumers of America in a way that the whole consent of the system is eroded, right? Now, of course, realists, mercantilists will tell you that the system should have been understood as mutually beneficial in the first place, right? So that gets into different theories about trade and international relations, with liberal theories arguing we can set up international institutions, we can create situations where we coordinate and work together for mutual benefit. Realists, mercantilists on the other side disagree with that and argue states always act mostly in their own interests, and the illusion of mutual benefits is a problem that denies the realism of self-interest in the state. So I think kind of what we're seeing is a transition, or political scientists would say, a transition in terms of the theories that are being accepted and implemented by the different parties through this process.
Yeah, and
So now
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to finish up by talking about, so now people would argue we're in a period of multipolarity, which doesn't mean that the US and China are equal in competition. What it means is there's alternatives for states to take when they line up. So smaller states out there looking for a trading partner for funding, for development or whatever, it's got options now. It's got multi places to turn rather than just a single one, which for 20 years was just the US and the IMF and the institutions we set up.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you go back to the turn of the 20th century in the U.S., as opposed to being completely reliant on your local savings and loan for capital. Now, in today's modern world, you have access to global capital institutions, and you have options as to who you do and don't want to partner with, and how you want to structure a deal. Trade, it's very the same way. Instead of just coming to the U.S. and saying, "What do you need from me to be a top trade partner?" You're going, okay, what do I get with the U.S.? What do I get from China? What do I get from other trade blocks, like European trade blocks? Do I want to align myself with with Russia, and other areas of the world that have been sort of on the outside of the U.S. plan, if you will, and talk a little bit about what that fundamental shift has looked like and where you see it going, right? Because you talked about maybe for the first time tariffs were used as a weapon. The United States still has the largest and wealthiest aggregated consumer base in the world. And that's not something that is going to change overnight or anytime soon. But we do see other economies emerging with a lot more wealth. Obviously, China has a much larger population and thus more consumers than we do. But on surface level, we still have a quality over quantity impact, if you will, from our consumers to their consumers, and just how we operate as a free trade economy here within the boundaries of the United States. But talk a little bit about where we're headed, right, and how these different political and policy decisions are going to formulate what the world looks like from a trade perspective over the next decade or so.
Yeah, so as you laid it out at the beginning, like the multipolar world now gives states options, right? And India, maybe most famously historically, and maybe even today, plays this game really well on sort of what are you going to give me, what are you going to give me, and sort of tries to find the middle ground there. But to be clear, I mean, even Europe is doing a bit of this now. Over the past 2 years, you see European investment in China continue to increase, while U.S. investment in China has been declining since 2020, since the first Trump, since 2016 and the first Trump regime. U.S. foreign direct investment into China has slowed out. Again, that in real terms, that means we're somewhat beginning to sort of decouple our economy from those. At least decouple our investments in production there. We haven't completely decoupled very much of our consumption of their products. The flip side of that is as you say, we've got this mass base of consumers. Europe's a big consumer base. Developing countries don't really have the purchasing power quite yet, and that's one of the things China's been sort of managing, this transition away from an export dependent economy, selling us goods, trying to shift to a domestic economy. I don't know if they're really trying to abandon their international production yet, but trying to build up a domestic base is part of the process. The problem, of course, is to do that, you need people to have money, which means they need higher wages, which makes your production more expensive relative to others in the world. So usually you have to choose one of these, what in IPE we call macroeconomic models. Either you're a trader, either you're producing to sell outside, or you're a consumer country, and you're basically consumption is your main engine of growth. Now the U.S. makes up for our consumption, right? So we're buying goods. U.S. dollars are leaving the U.S. to pay for those goods. We make up for some of that because we have its deep financial markets. So we've got money coming in to offset some of the money leaving in terms because it's coming in to invest in finance here and the financial stuff that we offer. We make up the rest of our trade deficit by borrowing money.
And as you know, another issue that we don't always talk about when we think about global trade and global trade policies, but you bring up a good point. You have programs like EB-5, where a lot of the money that may be going over to build wealth for individuals in China comes back with somebody who wants to then live in the United States, and they have to invest in the United States through something like an EB-5 program. Does that, in your opinion, fundamentally shift that distribution of wealth back and forth if we aren't sort of opening up our borders for capital deployment by foreign nationals who want to live here?
Yeah, that would definitely change that relationship because, like I said, one of the ways it's balanced out, one of the reasons we can run these huge trade deficits, one of the reasons Americans continue to sort of consume all of these cheap goods from the rest of the world is because we offset that with capital coming in. And if we don't, and that capital coming in, though, it wants something here. Like it comes here for a reason. We've got these deep, big financial markets. We allow all kinds of innovation in terms of financial things that sometimes are risky. We've got the Fed, and it's got deep pockets to sort of deal with the problems as they come up. And so it's one of the reasons we can do this. China, of course, doesn't have the same type of deep financial markets because they want to control the flow of money coming in. So that's one of the main breaks they made with the international order and the basic tenets around which countries were being told they needed to do to come into the WTO to modernize their economies, is sort of give up on what called capital controls, which just basically is countries want to control what's coming in, finance coming in, and what's going out to their country because it can cause problems with their domestic economy. China doesn't want to give up capital controls. It's learned its lesson from things like the 97 Asian financial crisis that economies can run really hot if you don't have capital controls, and then they can run into sort of boom bust cycles. Again, the Asian financial crisis, Thailand runs really hot. At some point, uh, investors start to figure out or start to guess that the Thai baht is pegged too high relative to where they're running, and so they're anticipating a drop in the Thai baht, and then they take bets on that, and then Thailand has to reduce the value of their currency, and it throws the whole region basically into recession because the contagion effect of what's happening in Thailand hits the rest. The point is that China learned that lesson about open financial markets, and in response, it's not opening up its financial markets in the same way. Right? It is a limit on China's ability to be the global hegemon because the U.S. still has the U.S. dollar, which is still the global currency, and China is not trying to internationalize the renminbi in the same way.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up a good point here. And before I shift gears, maybe away from like physical trade to the ideas around intellectual property and data and the Internet of Things and how that will impact world trade moving forward. Again, we talk a little bit about data being the new gold versus gold being gold. But as we look through it from an impact perspective. Obviously, we can't just go back to being an isolationist economy. What have been the top two or three things from a policy perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, that have disrupted trade and/or accelerated trade in the last, let's call it, 3 to 5 years? And what do you think are going to be those tools that we have to watch out for moving forward? Again, we've in the last 24 months, we've lived through tariff impacts. We've lived through the Houthis in the Suez shutting down. We've lived through, I don't know if you can call this geopolitical, but drought and the Panama Canal. All of these things have obviously drastically changed trade routes, not to mention political and military conflicts throughout the world. So what do you think the big things are that both can reshape and also accelerate trade from a geopolitical perspective that folks should be looking out for, or that we've seen that are going to continue?
I mean, some of the things that have affected it negatively, there's the sort of race for AI stuff and the attempt by the US to control that technology, which I think now we're starting to abandon because it was never really going to work anyway. There's an attempt to control chip technology, the production of chips, and who has access to them. And that, I think we said it was, national security reasons why we do it. And part of it probably was that, but that potentially sort of caused a problem. I think there'll be future similar problems, but around sort of these rare earth metals or the sort of inputs to technology that are distributed around the world that it looks like China may be ahead of us in terms of locking down supply chains for those goods relative to where the US is and potentially trying to catch up here around access to these types of minerals and what we do. I've had some really good students working on sort of issues around this, like doing mining in the US for rare earth metals. Yes, we don't like mines here. It's environmentally damaging, but if we just give it up to somebody else, right, they're going to do it even more dirty in Africa. And we won't have a secure connection, and those jobs won't be here, and all of this, and trying to argue, like, for an environmental perspective, to actually do mining in the U.S., which I know is controversial, but these are things that are going into inputs that we need. And so I think access to those things, because as you said, like, data is the new gold, but to manage the data, process the data, you need this technology. That technology relies on these rare metals that are out there that I think I think that's what a lot of the Greenland issue is really about, is about access to these minerals, a few other things going on there. The trading routes of the North Sea, I think, is also quite prevalent in that discussion.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because for the last decade I've been intimately involved in discussions around the transition to zero emission supply chains and zero emissions logistics and transportation. And one of the big ironies of it is that many of the precious metals and minerals that you need to be able to produce things like lithium ion batteries and clean hydrogen and many of the different resources necessary to move forward with zero emissions depend on working with countries who mine it, who, let's just say, are not on the same political wavelength that we are. And there's some strained tension with some of those nations. And so if you need cobalt, lithium, different precious metals and minerals, and the countries that are most rich with them are not countries that necessarily want to do trade with the United States, it puts us at a disadvantage as well. And so even as you said, like, mining may not be something that the typical environmentalist wants to do, but as they want to transition to cleaner supply chains, cleaner ways of just doing things in general, there's a bit of a trade-off that needs to be looked at. And it's either some sort of large political compromise that's going to let somebody else do it, probably dirtier and cheaper, that we won't have control over, or looking at a more environmentally friendly way to do mining of natural resources to be able to move forward with things like decarbonization and zero emissions agendas. And so you start to get into quite the political web, tangled weave, if you will, that makes all of this a bigger discussion than just how are supply chains and trade routes going to look in 20 years.
Yeah, to back up to our conversation just before, too, right? Is we should learn the lessons of the past too, and we don't want to get in bed, trading bed, and reliance on countries that aren't going to also follow sort of the politics that we want, right? So this lesson we just learned about overly dependence, and then we sort of elevate someone who's taking a political position internationally that we sort of is opposed to us. We don't want to do that again either, and so we should, pick our trading partners, develop them, and actually ask these questions, or at least try to tie together. Like, maybe if we're going to use and weaponize trade, maybe we weaponize it to promote liberal democracy, human rights, and these other things, rather than sort of promote just our own power or whatever is going on.
Yeah, and again, before we head into the last segment, which is going to be about political science and career trajectories, I'm really excited for that because I didn't anticipate being where I'm at today when I departed from the University of Vermont. But we talk about these natural resources helping foundationally form what global supply chains will look like. Again, there's a codependency. It's not like you can create a natural resource under your surface just because you want it. You need to find where those deposits actually are in the world. But data is something we do create, we do generate. Data standards, artificial intelligence continues to be more and more prevalent at the center of a lot of our discussions around domestic economy, jobs, workforce training. But if you also look at it, conflicts, global conflicts, are going to become less physical and militaristic moving forward. They're going to be more cyber in nature, right? There's going to be more conflicts that are dealt with through cyber hacking and shutting down of infrastructure and systems than there are physically troops on the ground having musket battles with people across the battlefield. So, talk a little bit about the role data is starting to play and will continue to play, as well as things like intellectual property and artificial intelligence as we move forward. Because that's, I think, one of the other arguments in favor of artificial intelligence is that it should make the jobs of American workers easier so you don't need as many workers, which means you may not have to go and do things like offshore labor or find manufacturing hubs that are in cheaper countries to manufacture. And artificial intelligence and data are going to drastically change not only the way we do things and how our partnerships with other countries looks, but it's going to create a whole new layer of global standards and could really influence how these trading blocks are formed through not just trade agreements, but essentially agreements on data sharing and agreements on intellectual property.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that there's the potential for AI and all of this to really greatly improve uh, all of our living standards, our peaceful interaction, etc. I just worry that that's not the way it's going to play out. Particularly, so you were just mentioning like data protection, AI standards. In my mind, and maybe it's just because of the era I grew up in and the things that I study, but in my mind, those things should be decided multilaterally between countries working together to set standards across all of these spaces, all these human communities in different areas. And if you don't do that, right, the tendency is going to be through the country that violates the rules gets some sort of advantage or allows a violation of certain rules that other countries don't. The problem, of course, is that we're doing this during a period where we tend to be sort of fracturing internationally. Like international institutions aren't pulling the political weight. They don't contain the political legitimacy they used to. And so all this is coming at an inopportune moment when we need this sort of coordination at hand to work together internationally to safeguard, to allow for this development, but safeguard it in a way that's going to bring benefits to everybody and not feed into tensions between nations and competition between nations. At that very moment, we don't necessarily have those international communities working in that way. Doesn't mean we can't get there again. We can get there again. And I think this is maybe one of the areas where we should start to work towards some common understanding, some common standards around data and what it can be used for, et cetera, in the international community. And I think that could be a springboard to build off of. And as you said, though, AI's ability to improve, to change the whole nature of our economy, where we produce things, where we mine them, what we do with them. Like it's quite fascinating, and the opportunity is wide open, like I said. But the opportunity, because it's so wide open, potentially also it's wide open to negative consequences, uh, inappropriate uses, power dynamics, and everything else. It's not absent politics, right?
Is,
And as a political scientist, I would say, of course, it's all about politics, but literally, you need to pull the politics back in and make them front and center. We can't. It's not just the technology we let go without politics.
Yeah, is it fair to say that this conversation around data, AI, et cetera, is a huge inflection point as it relates to what the world will look like, what trade partners will look like, what these trading blocks will look like 25 years from now? Because the foundational conversations happening now are going to, in some cases, take precedent over the conversations about physical goods moving from one country to another.
Yeah, I think completely. And I mean, I don't know the disruption this is going to play. I mean, the potential for disruption is gigantic to the point where, like a lot of the jobs that people currently do aren't going to be there. So then Like we could just make things here again, like rather than do them elsewhere. We could have robots that make all this stuff because the robotics is through AI is jumping through the roof too. The dexterity, et cetera, what you can do with robots, and so that's all going to jump forward. And so again, the potential's huge. I just think we need to do the politics of it before rather than after. We need to sit down together as a community and talk about what we want to do with this. And that's what I mean by politics. And we shouldn't just sort of see it as something that's happening and we don't have the space to discuss what we're doing with it. We need to have that space. Otherwise, we will sort of just produce these unintended consequences as we just lean into technology.
Yeah, this is probably a great segue into the last segment, right? As we talk about the future of workforce and AI and potentially being able to build more here in the US, it fundamentally shifts what people are going to do for their vocations moving forward. And I promised you I'd talk a little bit about, how I got to where I'm at. Maybe, I'll hand you over the opportunity to ask the questions. But, I know that you'll have students listening to this. And, when I went to school at the University of Vermont in the early 2000s, I never envisioned myself working in the supply chain. As I think I said, I wrote a paper about ports and trade, but my focus was more on the policy. Little did I know that decades later, I'd be actually working in the industry and talking about the impacts of this type of, for lack of better words, industrial colonialization and how it impacts global trade routes. But I very much have gone through a very interesting career route, right? And I left UVM. I was dead set on going into the legal field. I had a pre-law designation. After law clerking for a little while, I actually got more into true politics, lobbying for the National Association of Realtors and the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors, working on state, local, federal issues. And then that led me to move to California and have the opportunity to start being an entrepreneur and build my own public affairs firm in Los Angeles County and represent a lot of trade groups. So chambers of commerce, trade related groups like the Harbor Trucking Association, where I served as CEO for 7 years. And that evolution of becoming truly a policy wonk to somebody who can adapt policy, relationship building into being an entrepreneur. And I call this industry of logistics and supply chain quicksand. Most people don't plan to get into it, but once you're into it, it's really hard to get out. And you find that it's such an essential industry, as COVID demonstrated. Everything that we do, in the supply chain impacts every business, every person, especially with the Amazon effect. People are wondering, where's my package? It used to show up the next day. Now I'm waiting weeks to just have the inventory replenished. And so it shows how politics, in one way, shape, or form, relationship building, and the ability to understand how people can see things as wins and losses and be able to move the initiative forward through collaboration. I feel like my time at UVM and learning about politics, political systems, democratization, the law, right, through constitutional law classes have prepared me to be very effective in this role, in this career I've carved out in the global supply chain. Probably I wouldn't be here today if I didn't start down a path of thinking maybe one day I was going to be a governor or a senator or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so no, I mean that's great. Your story is like this amazing tale of sort of the political science education and the intangible skills that it gives you later on. That then sort of, and it's just interesting to watch your trajectory, and then you end up in this, And at the time, I'm sure it felt a little fraught and all over the place, right? But then looking back, you're like, oh, well, that's an interesting journey that we go through in life, and it's these moments. These hinge moments where we make these big changes, like they feel pressure at the time, but this is like what life is, and then following this direction, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think, to your point, I think political science degree, I'm going to say higher education in general, right, produces type of civic citizenship amongst people that is very important for society. So that's sort of the first thing I think, if we had the means, almost everybody should get like some degree of a liberal higher education, just because it produces a type of understanding of the world, willingness to listen to different ideas. I think one of the most important things you get from an education is you learn the limits of your knowledge, which is not understood by most people, that you go to college and what you come out with is actually, you understand that your knowledge is here. It's not here. You don't know a little bit about everything, but you have specialized knowledge about a particular thing. And that's kind of what life and careers are about, is finding a specialization and sort of digging into it rather than sort of these sort of broad things. And so that, I think, is something you get from the focus of a higher education. So there's that value. There's the particularities of a political science education, understanding how the world works through a political lens, and understanding, again, I stress this all the time in my classes, politics is everywhere. It's not just elections, it's not just voting, but it's sort of all the social processes, the interactions between people, the community, the conversations you have that inform your political worldview and your understanding. The more you understand how the world works politically and all of that, the more knowledgeable you're going to be to make all those decisions. And so I think that's great. I think we need, I mean, political science students come to me all the time and they want to know what they can do with it. The future of all kinds of jobs is up in the air, and they're looking for like concrete, this is what you're going to do with this degree. And again, it's political science is a bit more on the intangible than the tangible skills. We of course do need professors of political science to continue to teach the next generation, so that's kind of the straight line career path. You said you sort of never envisioned you'd end up where you were. I'm the opposite. My first political science class in college, I said I'm going to be a professor, and then here I am doing exactly what I said I was going to do. Just because it came easy, it felt natural. That was the space I was in, etc. But I also like your story and have other stories from students using a political science degree in other areas. In this case, trade logistics. In other cases, financial investment, giving advice on the geopolitics behind movements of different commodities and how you use that in finance, insurance as well, political changes, insurance markets. I've had former political science students go into insurance, a whole broad range of things you can do, because political science is fundamentally studying politics, which I start all my classes saying politics is about power, it's about informing decision making, and so it's applicable to all kinds of aspects of your life.
Yeah, my oldest son is just starting Little League, and if you want to find out how politics is everywhere, have your kids get into organized leagues like Little League or AAU or something. You find out very quickly that politics is everywhere, and I've often been told all politics are local too, because it all starts with your community, your neighborhood. If your community's not happy that you have a pothole in your community, it grows its way, and some of those people that fix the potholes go on to become presidents of the United States, right? So I think that that's super important to understand the intrinsic value of understanding how politics, with big P, if you will, works. Not just political systems and how do you put this, structured politics. But
Mm-hmm.
but the other thing I would say is, my the other direct thing that I would like to point out is I've been very involved, and I think political scientists, political science majors in general understand the importance of civic duty and building civic relationships. And from going from a lobbyist, for a trade group and building relationships and running a political action committee and starting to curry favor with policymakers and decision makers, you fast forward to where I'm at today. I chair the workforce board, the Long Beach Workforce Innovation Network. So it's a federally funded Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act board that's here to help create training and retraining and layoff aversion programs, et cetera, for residents in and around Long Beach. I also serve as chair of the Economic Development Corporation, currently called the Long Beach Economic Partnership, but soon to be rebranded as Invest Long Beach. And again, I've served on the workforce board under three different mayors. Currently, I chair it. The point I'm bringing up is I'm where I'm at as an entrepreneur and as an executive, mostly because I've been able to open doors and make things happen for different companies, whether they were clients of mine who were developing projects, or in the world that I live in today, inside of a company like Waterfront. The political relationships that you develop with a political science background come in handy, no matter if you're trying to call the mayor to get a permit to expand a program, and then work with the city functions that actually go through that process, or When I was the CEO of the Harbor Trucking Association, I actually put together a coalition of over 70 trade groups, and we lobbied and created the Ocean Shipping Reform Act that was passed in the early 2020s, and that type of thing all comes from the background of understanding political systems, understanding relationships, and those wins in my career, those opportunities to be exposed, to talk in the media, and be on things like Marketplace with Kai Risdall for NPR, and be on national television talking about supply chain in the Wall Street Journal, have led to me becoming a person that gets to pick and choose what I want to do and where I want to do it, because I've created a niche for myself. I've created a skill set that not everybody has. And sometimes you got to think outside the box. You've got to think about things as to, what am I good at? What am I passionate about doing? And not everybody's going to show up. And I haven't applied for a job in over a decade, right? I have conversations with potential partners, and investors and different people. And typically what I go do is very unique to my skill set, but it helps the companies that I work with advance to achieve their goals. And that's the biggest thing I would say to your students and to anybody out there, is like, get involved. And if you can understand how systems work and how people work, you have the opportunity to do some great things that benefit everybody that you work with. And that's the biggest takeaway I would say. Just because you're a political science major doesn't mean you need to be a staffer on Capitol Hill. But by starting in some of those obvious career opportunities and then following your path, not being afraid to walk through the open door or climb through the open window, metaphorically speaking, you can start to carve out opportunities beyond your wildest dreams. Again, I didn't look at myself as a potential logistician and venture capitalist 20 years ago. But guess what? That's primarily what I do. And it started because
Sure.
of lobbying and understanding basically how decisions get made in the world, and leveraging the teachings I had at UVM. So I've appreciated like I said, I loved my experience there. By the way, Burlington, Vermont, most beautiful place in the world, 3 weeks out of the year. Not quite this time of the year, but when the leaves are changing, there's nothing better than it. It's a first class institution that prepared me to get where I'm at today, 3,000 miles away, in a career and vocation that's not obvious from where I started, but it created the trajectory that I'm on today.
Yeah, no, it's another great success story. And like you said, like political science students tend to show up, right? Because they start to understand, once you study politics, you start to understand that this society doesn't just happen on its own. Like, right? People need to coordinate, create community, help each other out in order to have things happen. And once you get out there and start doing that, like your story again, it's just interesting the way it just sort of unfolds through that process, and just leaving yourself open to that, getting involved and doing it. And as you said, understanding the way relationships work, the way society works, the way the whole world operates around those human relationships, I think is key.
Yeah, I want to thank you. It's been a great conversation. Dr. Brad Bauerly, with the University of Vermont Political Science Department. I want to thank you for joining us today. Any final words for the viewers and listeners out there?
No, I'm just gonna wanted to thank you, Weston, for having me on. It's great to talk about this, and hopefully people can just start to think about the world a little bit differently through this conversation and take political science a little seriously.
Yeah, I mean, the policy decisions that we read about in the newspapers, and see on TV, and the discussions happening in local city halls and on Capitol Hill, those are the things that influence everything we do in our everyday life, either directly or indirectly. And it's important to be up to speed on the big decisions that are happening that are going to impact how we live our lives today and tomorrow. So, Dr. Bauerly, thank you for joining us. This has been another episode of On the Waterfront, sponsored by Waterfront Logistics. I'm your host, Weston LaBar. Until next time, thanks for joining us.